Of NAMI Tennessee at Home Live. Before we get to our incredible guest, I want to remind everybody I do this like every single episode. But listen. NAMI Tennessee has an email list. You just go to NAMITN.org and sign up, and it is absolutely free. And it tells you about all of the amazing things that NAMI Tennessee is doing. Things like our gala, our walks, our fundraisers. But here is, well, and things like this, things like NAMI Tennessee Live. But one of the biggest and proudest things that we do is legislative advocacy alerts. It's the way that you can help us change the way Tennessee sees mental health care and help influence our politicians to pass laws and get us services that we need. And we need you. So please, I know emails are a lot, but if you could sign up for that email list over at namitn.org, it will be extremely beneficial to the work that we are doing here at NAMI Tennessee. All right, enough of that. I am super excited to welcome Troy from the Trevor Project. You know, in the early days, Troy, I used to like introduce everybody and then like I'd read a little bio. Then I'd be like, introduce yourself. And they would all be like, you just did, buddy. So I don't do that anymore. So Troy, can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Certainly. Thank you for having me. My name is Troy Stevenson. I am the Senior Campaign Manager for Advocacy and Government Affairs at the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is the world's largest youth mental health organization and suicide prevention organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth. We have 24/7 crisis intervention services through live phones, text, chat, and one of the world's largest social networking sites specifically for LGBTQ youth called Trevor Space. We also have educational programs, advocacy programs, and research programs that are on the forefront of those issues throughout the queer community here in the United States. And we're moving abroad. We've actually started in Mexico as well.
Oh, wow. So it's international. I
Yes.
did not know that. That is really, really awesome. Now, Troy, you explained what the Trevor Project is, and I'm going to pop it on the screen one more time. To learn more, go to thetrevorproject.org. I'll try to pop it up throughout the broadcast. But I know you've told us about the Trevor Project, but let's talk about the work that you do as part of the advocacy team. Because advocacy is one of those, I'm an advocate. Okay, what do? I advocate. What does that look like? I know that there's a lot of mental health advocates watching, but how does the Trevor Project advocate? What are you advocating for? What does it all look like?
We have several priority issues. I run our national campaign to end conversion therapy. So we work across the country to pass statewide and municipal laws, municipal ordinances that protect LGBTQ youth from conversion therapy, which is sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts for those in the mental health field that will recognize the term. We also work on several other issues, one of which being the recent massive uptick in anti-trans legislation, predominantly aimed at trans youth across the country, as well as moving educational policy to where we have more suicide prevention policies that are being implemented in schools across the country. We work on non-punitive response to mental health crisis, advocating for better response for folks who are mental health providers to have more of an influence. We have also, over the last couple of years, been working heavily on something called 988, which is the 3-digit crisis mental health suicide prevention number. And this month, one of my colleagues is leading the effort to get that implemented and make sure that goes as smoothly as possible. So we have lots of things that we're focused on, but the way we do it is really staying on top of research, getting that research out into the hands of the people that need it, and also advocating for specific policy, which we know is best for LGBTQ youth. And we know that because of research and very metric-based things that we are assuring that these are the best policies we have in front of us.
Now, real quick, Troy, 988 has been a project that NAMI has worked on, and along with mental health advocates all over the country. And it just recently started up, and you said you're working on getting 988 implemented, and I know you mean with LGBTQ
Right. This very specific
information, etc.
one. Yeah.
Can you explain that specific? Because of course we see it very much from like a suicide prevention
Mhm.
and a police response angle, but 988 is much bigger than that. I think it's a definite opportunity to explain how big 988 really is.
I mean, we don't compare it to 911, but because it's a very different situation. But it is, on its basis level, it is a national number that folks can get um, crisis response immediately, and somebody will be there. What we're doing predominantly is focusing on making sure that LGBTQ youth are represented in that, and the funding and the mechanisms are in place to assure that they are represented, and that those calls are answered in a timely fashion, and that the system is ready to go from the beginning to where those calls get to the right places.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I know that 988 is a massive undertaking that involves so many groups, and it's nice to have one of those fellow organizations here, because it's just really hard to get with all of these other groups. Like, okay, well, it's going to do all of these things. Well, where are those other groups? They're
Right.
busy.
Right. I think everybody's got their own piece, and we definitely are working on that LGBTQ youth piece.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So my next question is, what does mental health among LGBTQ youth look like currently? And can you share anything that's specific for the South, for Tennessee?
Or, well, the way we gauge this is we do an annual survey, and our this past year it was 34,000 LGBTQ youth across the country, and we saw that they were facing significant mental health disparities. 45% of LGBTQ youth have seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, and nearly 1 in 5 transgender and non-binary youth attempted suicide, um, and that is predominantly heavy in LGBTQ youth who are within communities of color, and don't have peer support in many ways. 60% of LGBTQ youth who wanted mental health care in the past year did not receive it. And fewer than 1 in 3 transgender non-binary youth have found their home to be gender affirming. Specifically about the South, more than 1 in 3 of the youth we surveyed, 35%, were from Southern states. And our sample of Black youth were twice as high in the South. And we saw greater odds of suicide attempts in the South compared to those in other regions of the United States, and there are various reasons for that. But additionally, we saw a survey of LGBTQ adults in the South found that 69% between 18 and 24 reported having fair to poor mental health, which is shocking. And I think you and I talked a little bit before this and talking about Tennessee not having Medicaid expansion and other issues that just create some of those disparities. I mean, I'm not going to pretend to be the expert that knows every reason why these things are worse, but I think knowing that the outcomes are worse leads to a lot of questions about what are the differences in other regions, and the way systems and laws and social acceptance and rejection come into play.
One of the questions that came up in prepping for this episode is, well, what does mental health look like among LGBTQ youth currently? Like, couldn't the question stop there? Why did we add the, can you share anything specific for the South? And I'd like to pose that question to you, because I think some people are asking, well, what difference does it make if we're in Tennessee, Ohio, California? Isn't it all the same? And I imagine that there's a good answer here.
It's not the same. There's a reason, and you could take this state by state, but I think region by region is something that's easier to really extrapolate better numbers on. But it's like saying, why is mental health not the same in Canada as it is in the United States? Well, there's definitely reasons. One of them is access to mental health care. One of them is the level of governmental acceptance even. So what we've seen is a disproportionate number there were 300 anti-LGBTQ bills proposed last year in 2000, or this last legislative session in 2022. a lot of those were in the South, the majority, and or in Southern identified states. And I think that backlash, what that looks like to the population, what that looks like to young people, has to have an effect on feeling that their elected leaders are trying to do things that harm them, that will directly harm them. You've also got, once again, the disparities in mental health access, and that comes with things like not having Medicaid expansion, which is a thing in many southern states where it's not in many northern states and western states. So we also see these disparities in places like the Mountain West and other places. So it's not, the South is not alone, but it's striking. And plus, there's larger numbers, there's larger populations in the South than there are in some of the Mountain West places. So the numbers are easier to bear out.
I know that in mental health advocacy, it's not a direct correlation, it's not a direct comparison. So it's an analogy designed in a question. Please don't write me letters. But in mental health, one of the things that we have are cities versus rural areas, right? Some of the things that work in cities do not work in rural areas, and some of the things that work in rural areas just don't work in cities. Is it kind of like that? I mean, just every region has its own culture, resources, expectations, feelings. And if you try to just look at America as a whole and say, well, every single place is exactly the same, you're really kind of doing a disservice to the expectations and the culture of those particular areas. Is that really what it comes down to? And also, as you said, the resources of particular areas are going to change things.
Well, I mean, you really hit on something there. If you look at our particular survey, we found that nearly 49% of LGBTQ youth in rural areas and small towns said that their communities were either somewhat or very unaccepting of LGBTQ youth, compared to a quarter or 26% of those in urban areas. And if you think about it, you've got the diversity and the number of people, we've seen numbers go up for the last decade. If you look at the number of Americans right now that support marriage equality, it's like 71%, where it was 26% 20 years ago. A lot of that is coming from familiarity and people seeing people come out. They know it's their coworkers and their parents and their siblings, and these are the people that they know, and it's changing hearts and minds quickly. But when you're in small rural communities, you quite often don't have that access. You also don't have access to the resources that many people in more urban and larger suburban areas do have. So only 4% of rural LGBT youth reported their communities were very accepting of
Wow.
LGBT people. 4%. I mean, that's a number that's hard to imagine, because that usually 10% of anybody accepts something or doesn't accept something. So when you look at that small of a number, it's telling that they just don't have the access and the knowledge of other people. Not that I'm not talking about knowledge bases as far as education, but as far as world view experience of people who are different.
It's very easy to hate a nebulous thing, right? I hate this, and this is it's an idea, it's a free floating idea, but it's more difficult to hate somebody, a person who is standing in front of you, because most people have something that you like,
Right.
right? Even just I think of all the people who I like really dislike, and just I'm like, oh, your voice is so grating. But I respect their they have a beautiful lawn, they're great parents. I think, oh wow, you're an excellent spouse. But yeah, like you be an excellent spouse over there. But if somebody said to me, well, do you like people who talk a lot and smoke, and they have that, like, no, that just grates. That great. You want them out of your city? Yeah, I do. Well,
Right.
but see that you've created this picture of somebody that I'm already predisposed to dislike, and it's easy, right?
Right.
Is that sort of what you're describing? This idea that in smaller areas, people aren't coming out, people aren't open, so
Mhm.
you can't find those things that you like among the things that you're afraid of or don't understand.
It's the difference in the familiar and the other. When we talk about othering, I'm sure that you've seen the term othering many times,
Yeah.
but it's that person you don't know, that person you don't understand, or that's, like you just said, that selection of people. I know that I'm from Oklahoma, and a lot of my family, I'm live in a major city, but a lot of my family come from more rural areas, and the fact is, queer kids leave. People who are different leave. So it's, I mean, I can't explain the numbers exactly, but the anecdotally, I just know that there isn't that safety. Therefore, people don't stay. Therefore, people don't know, and it creates that othering process where they're a mystery to them because they don't know of them. You also see very homogenous communities in some of these small towns where they don't understand people of color or other faith-based groups that don't equate to theirs. So it's not just the queer community. This is something that is, when you're looking at such a homogenous community, you often see this kind of othering and bias that develops from it.
I think it resonates with a lot of people what you said about we just leave. It is certainly easier. I live with bipolar disorder. It is absolutely easier. It was before I just started telling everybody.
Right.
Obviously, I'm not a good example anymore. But back when I was still trying to keep it under wraps, it was much, much, much easier to live with bipolar disorder in Columbus, Ohio, with
Yeah.
1.5 million people and then 3 million people with all the suburbs. I mean, it's just this gigantic city, right? Nobody knew who I was or cared. But back
Right.
in the small hometown where I graduated high school, everybody and their brother knew that I was committed to a psychiatric hospital.
Right.
When I would go visit my grandparents, it's you could see it because it just went like wildfire,
Hmm.
and it was easy. So I was certainly glad to be out of the small town, given my personal circumstances, and I know that a lot of people feel that way in the mental health community. You've touched on it a little bit, and I just want to discuss it. There are, I believe you said, over 300 over 300 laws aimed at the LGBTQ community for any number of things, but it really they're attacking fundamental rights. They're attacking things that people are trying to do. Um,
Right.
it's difficult to put a positive spin on this when we're supposed to live in a free country, unless we don't like it, and then we're going to try to legislate it. But the anti-LGBTQ politicians are out there and they're attacking LGBTQ youth almost every day. I mean, I can't open up my Google browser without hearing somebody attack members of the LGBTQ community or members of minority communities. What is the landscape looking like? I want to say, hey, is it getting better? But that just seems like such a namby-pamby question. What are your views on all of this? It's got to be difficult to survive under this. These aren't just random people at your workplace. It's not a sticks and stones may break my bones situation.
Hmm.
This is These are our elected leaders who are passing laws, so
Right.
we can't ignore them.
Not at all. And I mean, many of these are not only misguided, many are dangerous. And they're also most often unpopular amongst the community at large. And I mean, these are fear tactics. So, I mean, we've done polling in the past year that showed that 85% of transgender non-binary youth, and nearly 2/3 of all queer youth, say that these debates about anti-trans laws have negatively impacted their mental health. Um, we've seen that 93% through our surveys of trans and non-binary youth are terrified of or worried about the denial of access to gender affirming care in their local communities. 91% are worried about being denied access to bathrooms. 83% are worried about being denied access to play sports or whatnot under our local laws. And so these are real people with real concerns and their children. And that's the most shocking part about these attacks, is that people are using children as political fodder to raise money and to create this narrative throughout the country that they're a danger. It's not the first time we've seen it. We've seen it throughout history, and we've seen, once again, communities marginalized and use fear tactics against them to prop up other agendas. And unfortunately, these young people are not only being used in this way, but they are being terrified because, like you said, these are elected leaders. These are powerful people in their community, and they're seeing and they're feeling that bias in such ways that it's, when we say dangerous, we mean dangerous.
Thank you. It's difficult to address these things because on one hand, I want there to be robust debate in America, right? I don't think that Gabe should always get his way, but I'm speaking on a personal level. There's got to be a thing like, right, are we going to legislate what Gabe can eat for dinner? And everybody's like, no, that's ridiculous. But if I say, well, are we going to legislate who Gabe marries? Well, of course. Well, now wait a minute. You thought it was ridiculous if the Senate took up what Gabe ate for dinner,
Mhm.
which is in my own home. But you don't think it's ridiculous if they take up who I can love or how I can dress or how I identify in my own home. And they're like, well, no, we do. We feel that we believe in smaller government as long as we can legislate everything you think or do. And it's curious. It's curious that we would accept it. And I'm saying that as somebody who is not directly impacted by this. So I can just think it's curious. And that's like such an insult to somebody who thinks that it's dangerous or life threatening. So I'm not sure what the solution is, which does, of course, bring me to my next question. What can parents, caregivers, and I'm going to add supporters of the LGBTQ youth community, what can we do to support them? I, it's not as simple as, well, just vote them out of office, right? I mean, we've got a real need right now. Elections can be 2-4 years away. What can we do right now?
I mean, one of the most fascinating, impactful, and important things, statistics that have come out of our research, is that 40% of queer youth are queer youth are 40% less likely to attempt suicide if they have one affirming adult in their life, not just a parent or a caregiver, but one affirming adult who they can talk to, who they can listen to. That's a huge number. And I think if you or anyone that's listening were told that they could save a life, somebody would be less likely to get cancer or to get some other ailment that could harm them in that way, they would do that thing for that person. This is such a simple lift. It is being an affirming person to a young person who doesn't have any other outlet, especially in those rural communities we were talking about, especially in places where these young people don't have access to community centers or support groups or groups within their school. So I think being welcoming and kind to LGBTQ youth, to their friends, to their partners, talking with youth respectfully about their identities, supporting one's gender expression, just using the correct pronouns, the correct names, because what does it hurt you to say whatever that young person feels is who they are? Their identity is theirs, and supporting them in it is a really simple thing to do. Educate yourself on LGBTQ issues. Educate yourself, especially on trans issues, and what is so impactful to especially trans young people right now who are feeling these stressors, who are seeing themselves attacked on television and in the media every day. And be openly respectful in discussing LGBT issues. I think talking about being an ally to any community, not just queer youth, not just trans youth, but people of color and women and anyone, it means that you don't only support them in front of them as well. It means that you work to destigmatize. It means that if someone were to call me an epithet to my face, I know many people would step up and say that's not appropriate. But if you're saying it behind my back, especially if you're saying it behind a child's back, being an ally means even in that situation, you say, no, that's not acceptable. And standing up when it's not easy, because it's easy to do that in front of the person, it might shut down, but it's much harder to stop those conversations, to stop that bias and to stop that bigotry in places where they think it's acceptable. Just like you would do for a Black person in an all white situation, and you hear the N-word thrown out, you would say, or you should say, that's not acceptable. Unfortunately, I know that too often people don't do that, and people are afraid to do that. But just imagine if you're afraid to stand up for that person when in that situation, imagine what it feels like to be that person.
Thank you. That's very well said, and I really appreciate it. The next question that I have, I apologize for sounding, it is confusing for me as a person, right? It's, on one hand, I'm super glad that we're having this conversation, and I'm super glad the Trevor Project exists, and I'm super glad that you're here. I just, it there's a moment that I think we need to acknowledge that it's a shame that we have the need for it,
Mhm.
and I don't think that that often gets said, and I just want to say it. And I don't know how you feel. There's actually, I'm going to hide this question.
Didn't see it.
Is it? Yeah, good. Everybody else, ignore the question. Strike the question from the record. The jury will disregard. I do want to ask you, Troy, on the Trevor Project does great work. You do great work. Things are happening. Things are moving. But on a personal level, how does it feel to have to do this in the first place? I know that's sort of a loaded question. It's a difficult question. So I'm purely asking for your opinion. Trevor Project does great work. You do great work, but don't you wish that you weren't needed? And how does that make like you feel?
The mission of the Trevor Project is to end suicide and suicidality amongst LGBTQ youth. That's aspirational. We know it. But our job is to work ourselves out of a job. And hopefully one day that's true. Hopefully one day bias against queer folks and black folks and women and indigenous folks and brown folks and everyone is a thing of the past. That is something that we hope happens. But until then, we have to continue to advocate. We have to continue to push back and fight against bias and discrimination in these places. And I think that it's important to remember that that's what this is. We're not just talking about, it gets boiled down into these weird talking points, and people they talk about sports and whatnot, but what this really is about is bias, discrimination, segregation, and the things about keeping people down and pushing them down. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's horrible to have to think about. I've been doing this for almost 15 years in some aspect or another, fighting for marriage equality and the dignity for queer people to have families, and then on to fighting against some of this negative legislation, fighting for non-discrimination laws, fighting to end conversion therapy. These things are all interconnected in a way that they shouldn't be. Just as you said, it's about dignity, and that's what we are pushing for, is to make sure that our community and others have the dignity just to exist. And I think, yeah, it's not nice to have to do, but it's something worth doing. The hardest part has been over the last couple of years watching this bias come towards young people, comes towards youth. Um, I I often am reminded that with marriage, with the dignity of marriage, people knew what that meant. Everybody knew what it meant to get married. They might not have believed that gay folks should be able to get married, but they knew what it meant. They knew how important it was. With issues like conversion therapy, people know what it's like to have a child harmed and to see that. And that is why it's something that we are seeing great movement in ending. We need more, but we're seeing movement. It's these places of discrimination, the discrimination against queer adults, but especially right now, the discrimination we're seeing against queer youth, that many people in the general public don't know what that feels like. They don't know. You can understand what it means to be harmed by something that is abusive. You can understand what it's like to be denied the dignity of marriage. But what people don't understand is what it's like to be discriminated against, because the vast majority of the population have never faced that. So when you ask what it feels like constantly having your own dignity drawn through the mud and watching another generation feel the same thing that we all felt, and hoping that we can stop that for them, and that the next generation after them won't have to see things like this.
Troy, one of the reasons I asked this question is because you're an adult. You are a grown man who chose to work in this field, right? You have other options. You can go work elsewhere. You chose it, and you can hear both the passion, the frustration, the concern in your voice as an adult. So
Right.
you can only imagine if that's how it's impacted Troy. And I we just met today, but if
Right.
that's how it's impacting an adult who chose to work here, imagine the 12-year-old, imagine the
Right.
15-year-old, imagine the 18-year-old. I'm, I've reached the age where I think 20-year-olds are youth. So I don't know what happened there, but
They are.
I, I, I really like to point that out to people, because so often we just think, oh, well, youth. No, they're not little adults.
Uh-uh.
They're some of the most vulnerable people that we have. So if this is how it is impacting a gentleman like Troy, we can only imagine how it's impacting a not fully formed, unaware, 12, 15, 18, 20, 22-year-old. So thank you for your vulnerability and being honest. And I hope folks can extrapolate like, hey, this is kind of a big deal.
Yes.
And I hope they see it as such. Troy, thank you. We're almost out of time. If there's any questions, please feel free to slap them in the chat, and Troy would be happy to answer them.
Of course.
But how can people get involved? How can people take action to better support LGBTQ youth on a community level?
Like I said, the most important thing, I'll go back to that 40% number. Being that accepting adult, that friend, that mentor or confidant that young person can go to, makes them 40% less likely to face suicidality, and that's the most important thing you can do. Folks can also get involved with the Trevor Project. We take volunteers all the time to help with our crisis services line that are supervised and monitored by professionals, but volunteers are very highly trained and help with these things. You can also look on thetrevorproject.org and find our guide to being an ally to transgender and non-binary youth, which is important. In the role that I play, we also look for people all the time to get active in their community, get active in their government, to vote. And we are a nonpartisan organization, so I will never tell you who to vote for, but look at the policies people are projecting, look at the things that they do when they're in the legislature, and make a decision in that space based on who actually represents you, because these are your representatives. Go to the Capitol buildings, go to your city hall, city council meetings when these bills and these ordinances come up, and make sure that your voice is heard. Reach out to those lawmakers, connect with your local LGBTQ groups. Go to PFLAG meetings, donate to your local or statewide LGBTQ group that is on the front lines of this every day. There's so many things that can be done, and being an active, engaged part of the community is the most important thing that folks can do.
Troy, thank you so very much. I want to pop the Trevor Project's website on one more time. Depending on where you're watching this, I did drop the link in the comments. The nice thing about Restream is that it puts us everywhere. The bad thing about Restream is it only lets us comment on certain social media platforms. So if you're on Twitter, sorry, you don't get to see it. But if you're on Facebook, or if you're on NAMI Tennessee's Facebook page, it is there. But just head over to thetrevorproject.org. Troy, thank you so much for being here. Before we, I always like to say, ride off into the sunset. Do you have any final thoughts or words, or anything that you would like our viewers to know?
Just once again, I've said it 3 times. Be that person. Be that person that is the person that young person is needing. I wish I had that person when I was 15 years old, 16 years old, because life might have been a lot better. So if you can just save one life, it's worth it.
Troy, thank you once again so much for being here. And before we go, remember, we have an email list. Troy, I get a toaster every time somebody signs up. I get a toaster. That's the running joke at NAMI Tennessee. But sincerely, NAMI Tennessee's email list is super powerful. Go to namitn.org. Aside from all the stuff we're doing, like the NAMI Tennessee at Home Live series, it's also where all the legislative advocacy lives, and it's absolutely free to participate. And we need all of the voices we could get, and that's the way that we organize you. All right, everybody. Until next time, we'll see you later. Bye, everyone.